Before anyone ever reached for a revolver, before a knife cleared leather, before a fight even announced itself, one of the most dangerous tools on the frontier was already in place, right there, on their feet. Cowboy boots were never just boots, and the men who wore them understood something most people still don't. On the real frontier, survival did not begin with a gun. It began with preparation, with control, with carrying what you needed in a ways no one thought to look for. Most people today see cowboy boots as fashion, as tradition, as decoration. That belief exists because the true purpose of those boots has been quietly forgotten. Cowboy boots were engineered. Every detail existed because it solved a problem in a violent, unpredictable world. The height, the stiffness, the narrow shaft, the heel, the pointed toe, none of it was accidental. By the end of this video, you will understand why cowboy boots were one of the most quietly powerful survival tools of the Wild West. Because the most important features were never what you could see. They were what no one ever thought to check. The frontier was not romantic. It was exhausting, dangerous, unforgiving. A man could ride for days without seeing another soul. He could cross rivers that swept away horses and supplies. He could wake up in a town where nobody knew his name and nobody cared if he lived or died. In that world, every piece of equipment mattered. Boots were worn every single day. They were not removed casually. They were not set aside when riding into town. They were not hung on saddles or left behind in camps unless a man was already asleep and vulnerable. They stayed on. That made them the most reliable storage system a cowboy had. More reliable than pockets that tore. More reliable than coats that could be stolen. More reliable than saddlebags that could be cut loose. If something was hidden in a man's boots, it stayed with him. The tall shaft of the boot was not decorative. It created vertical space pressed tightly against the leg by thick, unforgiving leather. That space became a natural compartment, and cowboys used it. The most common item hidden there was a knife, not the large Bowie knives of legend, not flashy blades meant to intimidate. Boot knives were slim, short, brutally simple. They were ground to sharp, unforgiving points and designed for one purpose: survival when everything else failed. A man thrown from a horse might not be able to reach his belt. A man pinned in the dirt might not draw a revolver. A man grabbed in a crowded room might not have space to swing a blade. But a knife hidden in the boot could still be reached. That mattered. Some boot knives were purpose-made. Others were improvised from butcher blades, broken tools, or scrap steel filed by hand. Appearance did not matter, only function. A boot knife did not need to look dangerous. It only needed to work. Money was also hidden in boots more often than most people realize. Silver coins wrapped in cloth, gold dust tied into small leather pouches, folded bills pressed flat against the calf. Why the boot? Because thieves checked pockets. They checked coats. They checked belts. They rarely checked boots. And even if they did, taking a man's boots was dangerous. On the trail, boots meant mobility. Taking them could provoke immediate violence. A barefoot man could not be safely abandoned, so cowboys trusted the boot. On long drives, a man might carry only small change in visible pockets, enough to satisfy a robbery quickly. The real money stayed hidden. This practice saved lives. But boots were not only for hiding valuables. They were weapons. The heel was heavy for a reason. Yes, it locked into a stirrup, but it also delivered force. In close quarters, a hard heel driven into a knee could end a fight instantly. A strike to the shin could cripple. A downward stomp could break bones. There was nothing cinematic about it. It was brutal and effective. The pointed toe served a purpose, too. It slid easily into stirrups, but it also focused impact. A pointed toe concentrated force far more effectively than a rounded shoe. Cowboys learned this through experience. They did not write manuals. They did not train formally. They learned by surviving. Boots also carried tools. Fire-starting kits were common. Matches failed. They got wet, they broke, they disappeared. Flint and steel wrapped tightly in cloth and hidden inside a boot could stay dry through rain, river crossings, and sweat. Fire meant warmth, food, life. A man without fire on the frontier did not last long. Boots also carried medical supplies, bandages, herbal powders, alcohol-soaked cloth. Injuries happened constantly. Rope burns, cuts, broken bones, infections. A small medical item hidden in a boot could mean the difference between recovery and death. But perhaps the most overlooked purpose of cowboy boots was psychological. A man wearing boots was assumed to be experienced, capable, potentially dangerous. That assumption created space. People hesitated. They reconsidered. Boots communicated readiness without words. This mattered in towns where guns were banned. When sheriffs ordered firearms checked at city limits, many men complied. But they did not arrive unarmed. Boot knives, hidden tools, steel carried below the knee. The law regulated what it could see. It never fully controlled what it could not. Boots lived at that boundary, always present, always ignored. This is why many frontier altercations ended without gunfire. A trip, a kick, a blade drawn from below the ankle. Quiet, sudden. By the time towns realized how much power lived below the calf, it was already ingrained. And like many frontier practices, it was never properly recorded because it did not fit the legend. Legends need visible weapons. They need drama. Boots were too ordinary, too subtle. But that ordinariness was the point. Cowboy boots did not make men violent. They made them prepared. As the West changed, laws tightened. Clothing softened. The open range closed, but the design remained. Even today, cowboy boots still carry echoes of that hidden logic. They look decorative, traditional, but they were built by men who understood one truth clearly. Survival favors what is carried quietly. And that is the real purpose of cowboy boots. Not fashion, not myth, but a hidden system designed for a world where danger never announced itself. If you enjoyed uncovering the truth Hollywood never shows, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Because the real frontier was not loud, it was prepared. And once you understand that, you will never look at cowboy boots the same way again. Boots as a survival system. Before the frontier ever became a place of legend, it was a place of exhaustion. Days were long, nights were uncertain, and nothing about daily life was guaranteed. A man might wake up under a clear sky and end the same day soaked, injured, hungry, or surrounded by strangers whose intentions were impossible to read. In that environment, clothing stopped being decoration almost immediately. Every garment had to earn its place. Boots, more than anything else, carried that burden. A cowboy's boots were the one item he never willingly separated from. Coats could be shed. Hats could be removed. Even gun belts were sometimes checked at town limits. But boots stayed on, because without them, a man was effectively stranded. They protected against thorns, snakes, rocks, freezing ground, and the crushing weight of livestock. Losing your boots wasn't inconvenient. It was catastrophic. That constant presence turned boots into something far more important than footwear. They became a foundation, a platform, a place where a man could hide what mattered most, knowing it would remain with him no matter where he went or what he was forced to give up. This was not accidental. Cowboys learned quickly that anything visible could be taken. Anything hidden well enough might save you. The tall leather shaft rising up the calf created a narrow pocket of space that no tailor ever advertised and no lawman ever wrote about. It pressed tight against the leg, held firm by thick leather that softened only after months of wear. That space did not swing, bounce, or shift the way coat pockets did. It stayed vertical, stable, and close, perfect for hiding items that needed to stay exactly where you put them. The most common item carried there was a knife, but not the kind most people imagine. These were not Bowie knives meant to be seen or admired. Boot knives were discreet tools. Narrow blades, often no wider than a finger, sharpened brutally and designed to penetrate with minimal effort. They were meant for emergencies, not duels. Moments when a man was knocked down, dragged, or trapped where drawing a revolver was impossible. A boot knife could be reached even when both hands were occupied or restrained. A man could hook his fingers into the shaft and draw steel upward in one desperate motion. That movement was fast, instinctive, and difficult to notice until it was too late. In close quarters, especially in crowded rooms or on uneven ground, that mattered more than any fast draw. Not every knife was factory-made. Many were improvised from broken tools, butcher blades, or scrap steel. Frontier life rewarded adaptability. If something could be sharpened and held an edge, it could become a weapon. Appearance did not matter. Reliability did. A knife hidden in a boot did not need decoration. It needed to work the moment it was drawn. Money followed the same logic. Pockets tore, coats were stolen, saddlebags were cut loose, but boots were personal. In most situations, taking a man's boots was dangerous and impractical. Barefoot men could not be left behind safely. So cowboys hid their real money low, close to the leg, wrapped in cloth or leather to prevent chafing. Silver coins, folded bills, and gold dust all rode in boots far more often than history books suggest. This created a deliberate illusion. A cowboy might appear nearly broke, carrying only a few coins in his visible pockets, enough to satisfy a quick robbery, enough to keep a situation from escalating. Meanwhile, the bulk of his savings remained hidden against his calf, invisible and secure. This habit alone saved countless lives by shortening confrontations that might otherwise have turned violent. Boots also doubled as blunt force weapons. The heel, shaped to lock into a stirrup, was heavy and unforgiving. A well-placed kick to the knee or shin could incapacitate an attacker instantly. There was no warning shot, no dramatic wind-up, just impact. In a chaotic struggle, that kind of force ended fights quickly and quietly. The pointed toe served a similar purpose. While it helped guide the foot into a stirrup, it also concentrated force into a smaller area. A pointed impact was far more damaging than a rounded one. Cowboys learned this not through training manuals, but through experience. They learned what worked by surviving encounters where mistakes were punished immediately. Boots also carried tools essential for daily survival. Fire-starting equipment was often hidden there. Matches were unreliable, especially after river crossings or heavy rain. Flint and steel wrapped in cloth could stay dry inside a boot long after everything else was soaked. Fire meant warmth, cooked food, and protection. A man without fire on the frontier was living on borrowed time. This is where boots quietly took on a new role. When firearms were removed from the equation, anything that remained concealed became more valuable. Knives hidden in boots were not subject to inspection unless a man was fully searched, which was rare. Most lawmen were concerned with visible weapons. A cursory pat-down might include coat pockets or a waistband. Few deputies knelt to inspect a man's boots unless they already suspected trouble. Boot knives thrived in this environment. They were legal in many jurisdictions because they were not immediately visible. They did not disrupt the appearance of order towns were trying to project. A man wearing boots looked ordinary, respectable, familiar, and that familiarity allowed concealed tools to move freely where open weapons could not. Cowboys were not the only ones who understood this. Gamblers, guards, and drifters adopted similar habits. Any man who expected to spend time in close quarters without a firearm learned to rely on what could be hidden below the knee. This dynamic created a quiet arms race between regulation and concealment. As towns tightened rules around guns, men adapted by carrying tools that fell outside those rules. Boots became an ideal solution because they straddled the line between necessity and concealment. A town could not reasonably ban boots. They were practical, expected, essential. Lawmen knew this. Many sheriffs were former cowboys themselves. They understood exactly what a man could hide in his boots. But enforcing a ban on something so ordinary would have turned entire towns hostile. So the practice continued, unofficially tolerated but never acknowledged. That tolerance had consequences. Fights in town rarely looked like gunfights. They started suddenly and ended quickly. A man might stumble, fall, or be knocked unconscious without a single shot fired. Witnesses often could not explain what happened. No gun was drawn, no blade was seen, just a scuffle, a sudden collapse, and silence. Boots played a role in many of these encounters. A kick delivered from close range required no warning, no dramatic motion, no escalation. In a crowded room, it was devastatingly effective. A hard heel to the knee could drop a man instantly. A strike to the shin could shatter bone. Once someone was down, the fight was effectively over. This type of violence did not fit the narratives towns wanted to promote. It did not look like a duel. It did not offer a clear villain, and it was difficult to prosecute. As a result, it rarely made it into official records. Boot knives added another layer of uncertainty. Unlike belt knives, they were drawn upward, often out of sight of onlookers. In the chaos of a fight, a man might never realize a blade had been used until blood appeared. By then, the damage was done. And because the weapon had been concealed so well, responsibility was difficult to assign. This uncertainty made towns nervous, but eliminating it was nearly impossible without resorting to extreme measures. Searching every man thoroughly would have slowed commerce, angered visitors, and undermined the image of order officials were trying to cultivate. So instead, towns relied on deterrence, signs, warnings, selective enforcement. Boots slipped through every crack in that system. They also played a role outside of violence. In towns, boots allowed men to move discreetly between spaces. A cowboy could enter a bank, a saloon, and a boarding house without changing his equipment. He could comply with the letter of the law while retaining a measure of personal security. This mattered because frontier towns were transient. Populations shifted constantly. Strangers outnumbered residents. Trust was fragile. A man could not rely on familiarity to keep him safe. He relied on preparedness. Boots supported that preparedness quietly. Even lawmen understood their limits. Many sheriffs chose not to push the issue unless forced. They focused on visible disruptions rather than hidden possibilities. As long as order appeared to be maintained, deeper inspections were avoided. This uneasy balance defined town life on the frontier. The public face of law suggested control. The private reality remained uncertain. Beneath coats and hats, beneath belts and shirts, Boots continued to carry the tools men depended on when appearances failed. As towns grew and professionalized, this tolerance narrowed. Policing became more systematic, inspections more thorough. But for a long stretch of frontier life, Boots remained a loophole that neither side openly discussed. And in that silence, the practice flourished. Men adapted not because they were criminals, but because they were realistic. The frontier punished those who trusted rules more than their own preparation. Boots offered a way to navigate both worlds, the lawless trail and the regulated town, without advertising either. That dual role is what made them so powerful. They were accepted everywhere, questioned nowhere, and they allowed men to retain control in environments that increasingly demanded submission. By the time the frontier began to fade, this quiet knowledge had already shaped generations. It passed from man to man without instruction, without ceremony, and without record. Because some lessons were never meant to be written down. Violence, psychology, and unrecorded encounters. Frontier violence rarely looked the way later generations imagined it. There were no countdowns, no formal challenges, and almost never an audience prepared to witness history. Most violent encounters unfolded quickly, quietly, and without ceremony. They happened in doorways, alleys, crowded rooms, and uneven ground where balance mattered more than speed. In those moments, the tools a man carried determined everything. Not the ones meant to be seen, but the ones meant to be reached when panic took over. Boots played a decisive role because they remained accessible when posture, space, and visibility collapsed. A revolver required distance, clarity, and intent. A boot required none of those. When men stumbled, slipped, or were knocked off balance, the fight moved downward. Limbs tangled, bodies pressed close, hands grabbed for whatever they could reach. In that chaos, weapons hidden at the waist often became unreachable. Weapons hidden below the knee did not. Many frontier fights began standing and ended on the ground. Dust, mud, spilled drinks, or uneven floorboards turned controlled movement into scrambling. A man on his back could not draw from a belt easily. He could, however, pull a blade from his boot with a short, desperate motion. That simple mechanical advantage decided outcomes long before anyone could intervene. Boot knives were especially effective because of where they entered the fight. They were drawn upward, not outward. That meant less space was required, less warning was given. A man could strike without telegraphing his intent. In a crowded environment, that mattered. Psychologically, this changed how men assessed one another. On the frontier, danger was not always announced by posture or expression. It was assumed. Every interaction carried the possibility that the other man was prepared in ways you could not see. That assumption created restraint. It slowed escalation. Or, in some cases, it provoked sudden, decisive action meant to end a threat immediately. Boots also played a role in intimidation without violence. The sound of heavy heels on wood floors commanded attention. The posture of a man comfortable in worn boots suggested experience. Many confrontations ended before they began simply because one party decided the other was not worth testing. This subtle psychological effect rarely appears in written accounts because it leaves no dramatic trace. There is no single moment to record, no clear action to describe, just a decision not made, a fight avoided, a risk reassessed. When violence did occur, it was often brief, a kick delivered without warning, a man collapsing suddenly, witnesses unsure what they had just seen. In many cases, there was no clear crime to prosecute, no visible weapon, no obvious wound, just a body on the ground. This ambiguity frustrated lawmen. It also protected those who understood how to exploit it. Without clear evidence, accusations dissolved. Stories conflicted, responsibility blurred, and the tools that enabled these outcomes remained hidden. Boots contributed to this ambiguity because they were ordinary. No one questioned their presence. No one thought to describe them in detail. A knife pulled from a boot did not leave the same impression as a revolver drawn in public. It disappeared back into the shaft as quickly as it emerged. Many such encounters never entered the historical record at all. They were handled privately, resolved informally, or forgotten deliberately. Towns eager to appear orderly had little incentive to document violence that undermined that image. Participants had even less incentive to speak openly. As a result, a significant portion of frontier violence survives only as rumor, inference, and indirect evidence. Broken bones without explanation, sudden departures, men who never returned to the trail. Boots played their part quietly, leaving no signature historians could easily trace. This silence reinforced the myth of the West as a place defined by gunfights alone. The quieter realities were lost, not because they were rare, but because they were difficult to narrate. A kick, a fall, a hidden blade lacks the clarity of a duel. It resists romantic framing. Yet these were the encounters most men prepared for. Not the theatrical showdown, but the unpredictable clash where balance, proximity, and preparation mattered most. Boots were chosen with that reality in mind. Over time, this created a shared understanding among those who lived it, a kind of unspoken literacy. Men learned to read subtle cues, stance, movement, footwear. They learned when to push and when to step back, when violence was inevitable and when it could be avoided. Boots were part of that language. They signaled readiness without announcing aggression. They suggested capability without demanding confrontation. And when all else failed, they provided a final option that did not rely on speed or accuracy, only resolve. As the frontier matured, these realities clashed with emerging ideals of order and civility. Town leaders preferred narratives they could control, visible rules for visible weapons, clear distinctions between lawful and unlawful behavior. Boot-based violence defied those distinctions. It operated in the margins. It blurred lines. It made enforcement reactive rather than preventative. This tension contributed to broader changes in policing and public space. Increased scrutiny, more thorough searches, greater emphasis on surveillance and suspicion. Slowly, the informal balance that had allowed such practices to flourish began to erode. But during its height, the frontier remained a place where what you carried mattered less than how you carried it. And boots, by their very nature, carried things quietly. That quiet mattered, because history remembers what announces itself. It forgets what ends before anyone looks. Decline, legacy, and the myth that replaced reality. The end of the frontier did not arrive in a single moment. There was no final showdown, no closing chapter, where one way of life cleanly replaced another. Instead, it faded through regulation, convenience, and forgetting. Practices that once made sense in a dangerous, unstable world slowly became unnecessary, then undesirable, and finally invisible. Cowboy boots survived that transition, but their meaning changed. As towns grew larger and more permanent, the balance between personal preparedness and public order shifted. Roads improved, law enforcement professionalized, distance shrank. Violence did not disappear, but it became something authorities believed they could manage through systems rather than individual readiness. In that environment, the hidden purposes of boots no longer fit comfortably. Concealment, once a survival skill, began to look like intent. Tools, once tolerated, quietly became suspect. The same practices that had protected men on the trail were now interpreted as defiance inside settled communities. Over time, those practices were discouraged, not by sweeping bans, but by social pressure and selective enforcement. Men adapted, as they always had. Boot knives grew less common in town. Hidden tools stayed on the trail. What remained visible became symbolic rather than practical. Boots still needed to ride well and endure long hours, but their role as covert storage and last resort weapons diminished as the conditions that required those functions faded. What replaced that reality was a story. As the frontier closed, people began to look back at it from a safe distance. They wanted explanations that were simple, dramatic, and reassuring. The chaos of everyday survival did not translate easily into legend, so it was replaced by cleaner narratives: gunfighters, duels, clear heroes and villains. Boots did not fit that story. They were too ordinary, too subtle, too connected to moments people preferred not to imagine. A boot knife does not photograph well. A kick that ends a fight before it starts does not inspire ballad. methods. These details were quietly discarded in favor of imagery that made violence look purposeful rather than desperate. Hollywood later cemented this transformation. Costumes exaggerated shape and decoration while ignoring function. Boots became visual shorthand for cowboy rather than tools designed for survival. The hidden logic behind their design was lost beneath stitching patterns and polished leather. Yet the design endured. Even as the meaning faded, the structure remained because it worked. The tall shaft, the angled heel, the pointed toe, all continued to solve problems related to riding, balance, and endurance. What changed was awareness. Few people remembered why those features existed in the first place. This is how practical knowledge disappears. Not through prohibition, but through irrelevance. When a skill is no longer needed daily, it stops being taught. When it stops being taught, it stops being named. When it stops being named, it becomes invisible. Cowboy boots retained their form, but their deeper purpose was no longer discussed. Modern wearers inherited the shape without the context. Today, boots are worn for identity, tradition, or aesthetics. They signal connection to a past most people understand only through stories. The reality behind that past, the improvisation, the quiet violence, the constant readiness, is rarely considered. But it has not vanished completely. Elements of that logic still appear wherever people operate in uncertain environments. Military gear, workwear, and modern survival equipment all echo the same principles: accessibility, concealment, redundancy, and durability. The frontier mindset never disappeared. It migrated. Understanding cowboy boots as survival tools rather than costumes reveals something larger about history. It reminds us that everyday objects often carry more meaning than celebrated weapons, that the things people rely on most are rarely the ones they talk about. The myth of the Wild West favors spectacle because spectacle is easy to remember. The truth favors preparation because preparation is quiet. Boots belong to the second category. They were worn, not displayed. They were relied upon, not admired. They worked when nothing else did. That is why they mattered, and that is why they were forgotten. When we strip away the legend, what remains is not a romantic past, but a practical one. A world where survival depended on choices made long before trouble appeared, on habits formed quietly and carried daily, on tools hidden in plain sight. Cowboy boots were one of those tools, not because they looked the part, but because they played it. If there is a lesson left in their design, it is this: history is shaped less by the things people celebrate than by the things they depend on. And the more ordinary something looks, the more likely it carried a purpose no one bothered to record. The frontier did not end because people became safer. It ended because the systems around them changed. But during its height, survival belonged to those who prepared without drawing attention. Boots made that possible. And once you understand that, the image of the cowboy changes, not into a gunslinger waiting for a duel, but into a worker navigating danger quietly, one step at a time. If you've made it this far, you now understand a version of the Wild West most people never see. Not the one built on noise and spectacle, but the one built on readiness and restraint. If you want more stories like this, real history beneath the legend, make sure to like this video and subscribe. There are more forgotten truths, more everyday tools, and more quiet survival systems waiting to be uncovered. Because the real frontier was never loud, it was prepared.